And thank you all for being here. I realize that at first glance, an afternoon session on the last day of a conference about regulation may not immediately seem like the most exciting or interesting or heart-racing thing, but actually I believe, and I think my fellow panel members do as well, that regulation is not just one of the most important topics here, but it's actually a really interesting one in that as Alex alluded to, some of us here have been involved in some pretty dramatic battles. You know, conflict is interesting. Conflict is, yeah, compelling. But what I think we really want to emphasize here today is the lessons that conflict provide, right? And ultimately, I think we all will probably end up agreeing that more conciliatory approaches are usually most effective, but maybe not. Sometimes conflict may be necessary and inevitable. So I would like to dive right into this by asking each of the panel members to just give a brief couple minutes explaining who they are and specifically the kinds of policy issues that they work on most directly.
I think the audience will be asking what is ST Engineering. I'm from Singapore. So ST Engineering is Singapore Technologies Engineering for short. And I'm the Chief Marketing Officer. Just to cut a long story short, ST Engineering is the largest defense technology engineering company in Singapore. We have grown global over the last 50 years. Our heritage is defense, but over the last 50 years we have diversified. And again, cutting a long story short, our focus today is really about bringing together, I think, large-scale systems to help cities transform themselves to be smarter, more efficient, safer, and more sustainable, and trying to overcome the challenges of, I think, increased density of cities, overcrowding, and of course, congestion. And one of the things that I've been working on really is about working with cities to see how they can actually take, I think, a longer-term view and also take a systems view in terms of the design of the larger transportation system that serves the city. And why is this relevant to what we are talking about today? You talk about regulations, but what I want to highlight is that actually behind the regulation is really about what the city wants as its goals for the transportation system it wants to build for itself. If you are clear on those goals, then the regulations will follow. And for a city, there are many things to consider, but I would, at this juncture, very quickly suggest that 3 areas which I think cities will need to think about as far as the longer-term goal as it goes about designing its transportation system and also to solve the kind of congestion problems that we have talked about in the last couple of days. Number one is really a talk about what is the target mode share for public transportation. It's quite important. Many cities today face congestion because the mode share for public transport is really low, so public transport is not viable, and therefore you have congestion. Two, about how a city wants to optimize the limited road networks that it has. Any city, of course, is faced with space constraint. Roads is always a premium, right? The real issue is how do you design the system so that you can optimize and squeeze most out of your limited road networks. And that means thinking about policies about whether you want to charge for congestion, whether you want to charge for usage, even charge for ownership of a car and having to park it. These are real issues. The other important aspect is also about trying to bring technology to bear so that you can use technology to optimize the road network. And when I say optimize, I'm talking about speed of the road. I can talk about that later on. And the last point, I think relevant to what we've been discussing in the last couple of days here, is really whether a city wants to think about making AVs as part of its larger public transport system. If that is the goal, then the entire system you create, the regulation you put on the table, the policies, actually will gear towards AVs being one that has ride sharing for point-to-point or even for first and last mile connectivity. And that is, I would say, 3 very important points that any city will need to think about. And this is something that we're working on, and quite relevant because I think you don't just want to jump into the regulation per se. You want to jump to what goes on behind that drives the regulations that matters. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, so I'm Chris Lake from the Land Transport Authority of Singapore, where I oversee the Autonomous Vehicle Program Office. So one of the things that we do, or the key thing that we do actually, is to coordinate and drive the national efforts in Singapore towards the deployment of AVs. And one of the most immediate priorities for us is really to do a pilot deployment of AVs in 3 of our towns in the early 2020s. So we're working quite hard to make this happen for Singapore. But of course, together with the deployment, it's not just about technology, it's also about enablers, things such as, I think, regulations that we're talking about here, but also other issues, public acceptability, standards, but also how you can even put in place the industry ecosystem that's needed to support deployment as well. So a broad range of issues that we're working on right now.
Thanks.
Hey everybody, I'm Josh Wilkenfeld from Uber, and there's an old joke that a group of people approach the sage of a town and they ask him, which is more important, the sun or the moon? And the sage responds, clearly the moon is more important because the moon shines when it's dark outside and the sun shines in the day when it's already bright. And there are echoes of this with the regulations of autonomous vehicles, believe it or not, because a key challenge that we face at Uber in approaching both the design of our product and the development of a very fluid regulatory environment for autonomous vehicles is a kind of classic chicken and egg problem. We need to know and understand the regulatory framework for autonomous vehicles in order to develop our product. As Dr. Bornstein said yesterday, the goal is not just testing, the goal is ultimately deployment. And so thinking through what a deployed, commercially viable product looks like is very different from running a science experiment to try to drive a car on a couple of blocks just to say that you can. But to do so, you sort of need to have visibility into the ultimate regulations. But understandably, our partners in the regulatory space are eager to know what this product is going to look like in order to design the regulatory framework. So the way to kind of cut through this knot that we've seen has involved sort of flooding as much information as is useful into the relevant channels. And so in the United States, the US Department of Transportation has called on developers to publish something called a voluntary safety self-assessment. Basically, a self-assessment of a developer's efforts in designing safely across a series of core elements for autonomous vehicles, 12 core elements. And we have responded to that along with a host of other developers to try to just keep dialogue moving with the public and with regulators. This is but one of several approaches to do so, to further understanding of what an autonomous vehicle product would look like at scale, to sort of help move towards a stable regulatory framework. And beyond this, a step that Uber has taken in the last few months has been to publish what we call our safety case framework, basically a list of factors that we believe are necessary for the development of a safe autonomous vehicle product at every stage of development. And these are factors that go beyond just functional safety, though functional safety is important, but also speak to an organization's ability to support an actual commercially viable product in a safe manner. So our hope is that the more we can sort of contribute to an understanding of what a safe product looks like, the more we can sort of dislodge this stalemate between regulations that are developing at an incredibly rapid pace, but still aren't in the state that we see for some industries, and our own product development efforts.
Great. Hello, everybody. I'm David Spielvogel, Chief Policy Officer at Lime, where my job is mainly to work with governments around the world to increase the use of micromobility and find the best policies to put in place to help it become a safe industry. I actually come from the regulatory background, which in San Francisco, where I'm based, is sort of seen as the dark side. We're the people who tell companies what they can and can't do, and it's a very interesting transition to go from that into the company side. I worked in a few administrations in the White House in the US, and then most recently was senior advisor in the city of Chicago, where I got to regulate Uber and other emerging industries that don't exist one day and the next day are a big crisis in your city. So I bring that mentality with me to Lime. I would say there are two things which everybody sort of touched on that guide the work that we do and that I think should guide the work of any government relations group. group. The first is collaboration. If you think about your relationship, by the time something becomes a real problem, it's way harder to deal with it. For those with a spouse or significant other, you know that. So I'm really big into building relationships early, keeping communication open, and calling your regulators even when everything's going well, because you just need to find out what that kernel of a problem is and solve it proactively. And second of all, I think we as companies have a responsibility to take the things that we're really good at. We have a ton of data. We can draw insights from that. We have great engineering staff and data scientists. And we have a responsibility to take that and use it proactively with governments to help them make smarter decisions, a lot like what you were talking about in terms of the autonomous industry helping to use their knowledge to craft regulations.
So I'd actually like to stick with you really quick here because you have sort of experience on both sides of this. I'm really curious. One of the things that we've seen a lot of in mobility technology sort of broadly is this sort of strategy of asking forgiveness rather than permission, showing up somewhere, deploying, and then waiting to see that. Has that approach worked? It seems like you mentioned collaboration. I'm curious if you think that's worked, and if so, or if not, why, and sort of how does that inform your approach?
Yeah, it worked for about 6 months way back in 2013 when Uber would go into cities, Airbnb would go into cities. And I actually think at the time it was probably a very smart political strategy because cities, states, national governments didn't know how to deal with it. It does not work today. So and even Uber seeing it with their newer modes, the governments are way more smart about what technology companies are trying to do. And I think technology companies are moving way more into the public space than they were 5-10 years ago. So rideshare, for all the hullabaloo, it's just cars using the street, nothing new about that. For micromobility, which is what we do, small vehicles, totally new, people don't know where to use them. Autonomous vehicles, very new. The fact that we're using public space in a different way has got governments even more aware of what's going on.
Yeah, Josh, would you like to?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. And I used to, like David, work in the U.S. government. And as was mentioned at the outset, I was at the U.S. Department of Justice. And now that I'm focused on autonomous vehicles, I can confidently say, and I advise the same to Uber, that if you think you're going to drop a bunch of autonomous vehicles with LiDAR spinning on their tops in a bunch of streets, that's the kind of thing authorities tend to notice. There's no sub rosa ability to slip those through, nor would we want to. So, I completely agree. The imperative has to be on collaborative partnership with regulators. I do think, though, and certainly this is not an ask forgiveness, not permission approach. But I do think that there remains, though, a critical element, as we were sort of describing early, to engage in proactive consumer education. Because one thing that was a virtue of that approach was you built customer loyalty, and then that, as everyone knows, that helps with your political arguments if people love your product. And so, I absolutely would not advise deploying autonomous vehicles without active engagement with regulators of all types. But I think that we shouldn't lose the instinct to sort of loop in customers along the same timelines that we loop in regulators. Now, it's difficult to do that with products that we don't want to deploy absent that type of regulatory engagement, but I think the onus is on companies like Uber and others who are actively developing in this space to try to bring our customer base along to understand the sort of safety benefits along with accessibility benefits in improving transportation access more generally that will come along with autonomous vehicles, so that when we are at the point where we have sort of developed the necessary relationship with regulators to enable us to deploy, our customers are sort of ready to appreciate the benefits of that product.
Chris, how has Singapore navigated this issue? I don't think I've heard of companies just kind of showing up there. So I'm wondering, is that a question of being proactive and having like pilot programs and outreaching in advance, or is it about harsh penalties for people who come in? Explain.
So Singapore, I suppose, falls under we're more like the other type of approval regimes like in Europe. So we do have a vehicle authorization regime where, if anyone wants to bring in a new vehicle into Singapore, they have to get approval from us, the LTA. So this is a little bit different, I suppose, from the US, where it's more of a self-certification kind of approach. And vehicle developers can just come and, I suppose, test their vehicles. But so far, I think in Singapore, at least, we've had quite a number of developers. Aptiv from the US is testing in Singapore. There used to be Nutonomy, who's now part of Aptiv as well. But we have also players from Europe, Continental, EasyMile, etc. We have, of course, our own local companies like ST Engineering as well. So we have quite a few folks actually doing AV trials in Singapore. They've come to us, and through, I think, a very collaborative approach, we have looked at how we can, I suppose, authorize these vehicles to test in Singapore. And I think we are quite unique in that we're still probably one of the very few jurisdictions in the world where, as the authority, it's not just about us getting an application and giving the authorization straight away after a documentary review or something. We actually, together with our traffic police, test and certify the vehicles before we allow them to apply on our public roads. So that's a little bit different, and I think talking to some of the companies, especially from the US, it's a new thing for them. But what we've actually found is that they have also appreciated this effort, that we are putting into test and certify the vehicles, because I think they found that it helps them in terms of identifying potential blind spots. It also gives them some certainty because, if they have a regime where there's a lot of uncertainty, especially say when something goes wrong, they don't quite like that. So the fact that we have such a regime, I think, helps them as well. And some of them have told us that, the AV industry always says this, if there's an accident, the whole industry is set back. So, if we have a regime in place that ensures that there's a certain minimum standard or minimum bar that companies have to pass before they can deploy their vehicles on the road, it helps everybody because you make sure that everyone who's there, out there on public roads are already at a certain level of capability.
Yeah. And Mr. Chu, so at a really high level, one of the fundamental, balancing acts in regulation is sort of, especially with new technologies, right, is on the one hand, you don't want to stifle innovation, right? You don't want to keep innovative companies from doing innovative things because it can be the engine for growth. On the other hand, you also do need to protect the public. You have a responsibility to the public. And in the United States, for example, we've seen, with autonomous vehicles, for example, lots of different approaches in different states, and sometimes like radically different outcomes. I'm curious, from your perspective, sort of, how do you think about that balance?
Very tricky. I just want to add on to what was just said. I think the audience also need to remember this particular point. You go to any city, you talk about transportation, there's always a political element to this. Always. Okay? You can't run away from this. Because transportation is a major touch point for all citizens. If the city needs to vote for its mayor, vote for the authority, anything to do with transportation that's gone wrong will affect the votes, and therefore affect the guy in charge. And exactly because it's political, sometimes it's important actually to strike a very careful balance. When you start introducing something, and of course if the city wants it to be introduced, that's good. But we, in the process of introducing something, let's say like AVs, for example, I think it's also incumbent upon whoever is trying to introduce the technology, the capabilities, actually take a more holistic view in terms of what's the performance standards, what's the safety standards, how do you work with the authority so that actually you can meet all the requirements, or at least the initial requirements, and then probably feel it in a way that is, I think, a bit more, in a process that is going through a few step-ups. So you don't jump in and try to introduce an entire system because you're not totally clear whether the entire system can work. You start off with pilots. You start off with, from the pilot going to, I think, a bigger pilot, and then from there, determine how you can scale. So you need to strike this balance very, very carefully. And we do that, I think, a lot in Singapore. But likewise, when we try to go to other cities and try to bring AV technologies, it's the same approach. In fact, ST Engineering now trying to work to bring AV technology for potential trials here in Tel Aviv. But we also find that we have to now engage multiple parties to see how is it that we can actually work within what they think should be the regulations, and then be able to actually put on trial so that we can have a public service that the commuters will be actually be comfortable with. Yeah.
I just wanted to very quickly add on to I think what was said, because I think this point about the balance between regulation and innovation, it does actually differ from country to country, city to city even, and that's often at times I think forgotten. And I mean we were talking a bit about this earlier. At the end of the day, it's about the political environment in the particular city or country, and that is something that I think companies have to take into account. That when you do come and deploy, there will be these differences, and you can't expect, say, for instance, the regulatory regime to be the same or to be uniform across different countries.
So I agree. I think, though, in certain situations, it's a false contrast between regulation and innovation because, especially in industries like these that are new to the public, the assurance that can come from a regulatory framework that gives, in some ways, a check to the public that this is being deployed responsibly actually can help promote innovation, right? So having a product that people are scared of and that people won't want to use is not helpful to our innovative cycle. So the type of partnership that sort of David described at the outset, we would never ask we would never ask Singapore or another sort of government entity to endorse our product per se, but I think that there are ways in which that type of partnership is complementary and doesn't serve as a check. Certainly there are cases where regulation can be burdensome for industry. I worked at the Department of Justice. I probably participated in crafting some of those, and sometimes that's necessary. But in certain cases, I think the public is eager to see that type of partnership so that they can see a sort of responsible deployment pathway that then they can more easily latch onto.
David, are there specific lessons? So micromobility is like blown up just in such a short amount of time. And it's funny, we were talking about AVs before micromobility even came around, and they're kind of still not here yet. And so it seems like there's an opportunity here to take another sort of experimental test case of a new technology coming into the market. Regulation is clearly going to be very important to both of them. What can AVs learn from the micromobility experiment?
The very brief micromobility experiment, I think one of the key things is that early in technology adoption that affects the public way, the worst player is going to be representative of the industry. So when we're in a market and a scooter malfunctions or somebody gets hurt, it's not about that individual company. It's about micromobility and scooters in general, and we all suffer. In Tel Aviv, there's an interesting phenomenon, and I was sort of shocked when I've been here for a week now. Like the use of private scooters is insane, and there's no regulation around that really. So something happens to somebody on a private scooter, then during my meetings with City Hall this week, those issues come up as a shared mobility challenge. So I think the industry, it sounds like, is very proactively working on setting ground rules before you go. We work with all of our partners in Tel Aviv and around the world on certain issues. And it's really critical in those early days that everybody behave really well, because the worst player will bring everyone down.
Josh, I mean, one of the real challenges, particularly with AVs, is that, unless you're really an expert, unless you're working on them, it's really hard to understand them. I mean, this has been a huge challenge for me, just trying to cover them and trying to explain them in a way that the broader public can understand. And certainly I've noticed a number of politicians, including some who are like high up in Department of Transportation, for example, like struggling to understand some fairly basic things about how AVs work in particular. Are regulators generally, and obviously this will vary from place to place and instance to instance, are they prepared to really tackle the challenge, the regulatory challenge that AVs present?
Sure. So as you note, there's a wide array of regulatory sophistication on that, but even beyond that, I'll say, you're right. These are extremely complex products that are difficult to sort of understand at the kind of core engineering level. But I think one area where we've had success in engaging our regulators and our legislative partners has been to sort of eschew a conversation about the underlying functionality and think through the sort of benefits and drawbacks of deployment of these devices. And I think that's a very intuitive pitch for regulators to understand, right? So the notion that, and this I think speaks to themes that pervade throughout the conference, that the deployment of autonomous vehicles can lead, first and foremost to a major safety benefit, right? So in the United States, we have something around 40,000 deaths from vehicular accidents accidents. About 95% of those are caused by human error. Here's a potential to ameliorate some of that. And then beyond that, improvements in productivity by reclaiming lost time spent driving. I mean, as our panelists are pointing out, there's something extremely palpable about the pain that comes from getting stuck in traffic and being behind the wheel. And regulators intuitively understand that and intuitively understand the benefits that can provide to their constituents. So I think sort of focusing on that element has been a sort of successful approach for us. And that has really pervaded the regulatory community. So for example, the US Department of Transportation has been clear that their focus in regulating autonomous vehicles, as well as sort of other modes of transportation too, this is a sort of broader policy focus of theirs, would be on performance standards, right? So they are not interested, they say at this stage, in specifying that a LiDAR must be able to pick up a data point at this distance and must be able to process it at this speed. What they want to know is, like, can you execute to this type of performance function? And that's been the same type of philosophy that they've provided, for aviation and some other modes too. And in a way, that actually helps sort of speed past some of the technical complexities that you might need to understand if you were trying to regulate to the specs of the system as opposed to what the system is meant to accomplish.
Yeah, and yeah, please.
Just wanted to add, whether the authority actually wants to get into the complexities of AVs and willing to actually embrace it and then form the regulation so that AVs can introduce really comes from the larger starting point is what is their vision as far as the AV is concerned? What do they want to do with it? And in the case of Singapore, I think Singapore has really identified very clearly we need AVs to be part and parcel of the larger public transportation system, to provide ride share, to go point-to-point alternative, or actually for first and last mile connectivity needs, so that you have a much more efficient, I think, much more effective public transport system is a larger goal. If you start from that particular point, and then the authority will want to come and embrace this. So I think we need to actually engage with the authority, understand where do you think the AV actually fits, and then you can think about how is it that you can actually regulate for its introduction. Yeah.
If you have thoughts on this, yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to also add that I think I fully agree with Josh, and I think as regulators as well, there is a role for us to really reach out to industry as well. I mean, it is a two-way street, and I'm not sure that regulators are doing enough of that. And I mean, so as one example in Singapore, where I think we've found it very heartening, where we have industry joining us in our AV deployment efforts. We're working on a set of technical standards for the deployment of AVs. We've come up with a first iteration that's been released earlier this year already. And for this effort, actually, we have quite a number of players from overseas as well as locally joining us in the working groups that came up with this set of technical reference. So ST Engineering was one of them, but Uber actually is also part of one of our working groups that created this technical reference. So, I think we're looking forward to really industry joining us as we do more. But, I think we are quite mindful that we also have to reach out to be inclusive and bring in as many different players as possible.
So I actually want to ask you something about these standards you're developing. One of the kind of amazing things, and this is one of the things I think about when I say, regulation is exciting. I mean, we've seen political battles that spill over into street protests over data standards. I mean, who could have imagined that people would get so worked up about data standards? But they really do matter. These are really important and battles. I'm curious, how much data do you think cities need? And so, first of all, I guess, is Singapore requiring data sharing for either AVs or other forms of new technology on its streets? And sort of, how do you think about the balance there between, how much data you need to pursue the goals that Mr. Chu was talking about?
I think you ask most cities, the answer will always be, as much data as we can get. But I'm not sure that that's necessarily the right answer because, if anything, I think we are all of us, I think companies or government alike, we are all swamped with data, and not all data is useful. So the question is, are we getting the right kinds of data? Is it cleaned up and ready for use? So I think it's something that cities are still struggling with. In Singapore, at least, for AVs, we know that we do want certain limited forms of data in order to assure our citizens that as the government, as the authority, we have a handle on what the AVs are doing. So we actually do require AV companies to submit to us certain data such as where the vehicle is, GPS location data, their speed, whether they're driving autonomous mode or not, things like that. So again, I think we're one of the very few jurisdictions that require this, and so far that's been fine. I think the companies have been quite happy to give it to us, but we're not even getting into other types of data because should we as a city require the vehicle health? That's something that I think we will have to grapple with. I think companies would be quite mindful at this very early stage to share with us that kind of data. But maybe 10 years later, when the technology is mature, I think they may be a bit more comfortable. So it's a conversation that's still ongoing. I think for us in Singapore, but certainly anywhere else in the world as well.
Yeah, Mr. Spielvogel, I got to get you in here.
Yeah, really quick. I think one of the biggest confrontations between our companies and government going forward is going to be data sharing around personally identifiable information. There are a lot of governments now who want to know who's on a scooter and where they're going and where they are on the trip versus where did a scooter start and end or other things you might use for enforcement. And the battle is brewing, lawsuits are starting to be filed, and I think it's going to be a real clear definitional battle moving forward.
But even just locational data alone can ultimately be identifying, right? I mean, we've seen instances of that
Yes.
where purely with that anonymized location data, you could actually identify who the person is because, they go home to this address every day. Huh.
Correct.
Yeah.
So I think that is, people are sort of slow walking it right now because industry wants to grow and government wants it to grow, but be careful. And it's going to blow up very soon.
See, I told you, excitement. It's exciting stuff. Go ahead.
So I completely agree. I think that there are two different types of data conflicts, and these two comments sort of point them out, right? There are data conflicts that arise due to actual principled disagreements, right? So in the situation you're describing, cities that we know of, they specifically and affirmatively want personal data, and our companies think that we shouldn't be providing it for principled reasons. So that's a difficult conflict to resolve. In some ways, I think the type of conflict that Chris is describing is a little bit easier, where the city or a jurisdiction just wants all the data because it doesn't know sort of what it's looking for quite yet. And there we have a real opportunity to sort of work collaboratively, I think. And when I was at DOJ in the Obama administration, we had sort of a series of policies that I worked on the nature of cooperation. And a key point that we tried to make, because many of our criminal defendants either didn't get it or were intentionally trying to suggest they didn't get it, was the idea that just giving us everything is not cooperative, right? So genuine cooperation involves two things. It involves sort of helping the regulator to actually diagnose an issue or a question in an efficient way. And that in turn requires the second thing, which is credibility, right? So in order to sort of allow for that relationship, the regulator has to be able to trust that the counterparty there is being an honest broker, right? So if I'm Uber and I'm saying I'm cooperating, here's the package of data that you need to know, I can't be cherry picking data to sort of tell the story that I want that's not representative of reality. And those types of relationships are built over time and are sort of blown in an instant. But I think that's the sort of crucial challenge to help ameliorate the type of issue that Chris is describing, to sort of assuage the understandable first impulse to just request everything in order to find the needle in the haystack.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of this conversation has ended up sort of circling around something you said, Long, at the very beginning, which was that a lot of this comes down to the cities or the regulators knowing what they want, having that vision, because then it seems like, that's the basis on which you can decide in any given conflict, is this furthering that vision or is it not? So can you just briefly, we're almost out of time, but can you just talk about sort of like how, what is Singapore's vision and sort of how do they use that to?
I think my colleague is in a better position. But very quickly, I think Singapore recognizes straight away, because of the land constraint it faces, we only 720 square kilometers. So 12% of the land is actually dedicated to roads. We cannot grow a road network anymore. So we are 5.6 million people, 1 million vehicles. This is it. So bottom line is the future is about trying to go away from the roads, trying to basically design and build, I think, a very efficient public transportation system with mass transit as a backbone. That means metro, that means buses, and of course in the future AVs, so that we can bring the mode share to a much higher level. Today, the mode share in Singapore is 71%. 71% of all trips in peak hours are undertaken on public transport. We are trying to aim towards to get to 75 by 2030, and that means you do need a very strong network of metros, you need a strong network of buses, and AVs actually feature quite interestingly because AV can be a very efficient way in which you can actually generate, I would say, basic movement of first and last mile connectivity to your major transportation hubs. You do that, I think then you really have very ease of movement. And that, I think, is really the larger end goal. Yeah.
Well, unfortunately, we have run out of time. I feel like we are only just scratching the surface of some really fascinating stuff here, but hopefully this gave you a sense of how interesting and complex and exciting and important regulation of new mobility technology is. So thank you all for this wonderful conversation, and Mr. Roy.
Oh, and the most exciting thing about this panel is that I was listening to our friends from Uber and Lime speak. How many of you were here to hear Deputy Mayor Maital Lahavi speak earlier? How many? So, can you imagine if these guys had to face up against her? That would be absolute fireworks. Talk
We
about
should
warfare.
do that for next year's regulation.
That would
panel.
be amazing. I really enjoyed that too, guys. Thank you so much.